On a late winter day in 2018, as the sun faded behind layers of gray clouds, a convoy of black vehicles quietly navigated the narrow roads of Georgia. There were no blaring sirens, no flashing lights, and not a single reporter in tow. The entire journey was cloaked in secrecy, as though it was meant to remain unseen by curious eyes. Sitting in the lead SUV was the President of the United States, Donald Trump, but this time, he wasn't making his usual appearance behind a podium or at a grand public event. Instead, he chose an entirely different path, a journey without scripts, cameras, or cheering crowds. His destination was a place few in society would have expected him to visit, a correctional facility on the outskirts of Georgia. Just months earlier, Donald Trump had signed the First Step Act, a groundbreaking reform in the U.S. criminal justice system, offering reduced sentences and opportunities for reintegration to thousands of inmates. But for Trump, the act of signing a piece of legislation wasn't enough. True reform isn't about signing papers, he had once said. True reform is about seeing it in the eyes and feeling it in the hearts of those who've been forgotten. And that was why he was here, stepping through heavy iron gates to witness firsthand the impact of a law he deeply believed in. The cold air outside only amplified the stillness within the prison walls. Towering concrete barriers and coils of razor-sharp wire loomed overhead, underscoring the gravity of the lives confined within. Yet, in Donald Trump's eyes that day, this place was not merely a prison. It was a space filled with potential, a place where hope could take root and new beginnings could emerge for those willing to change. Accompanying him were a small group of trusted advisors and the prison's management, the only individuals privy to this unannounced visit. Together, they walked down the long, cold corridors, where the echo of their footsteps seemed to whisper untold stories. With every step, Trump carried not only the image of a leader, but also the weight of a larger message, that even the most wayward paths could still find light. This wasn't just a routine visit. It was a silent declaration. In the solemn atmosphere of that day, the journey became a quiet testament to the enduring values of forgiveness and second chances, ideals that every person, regardless of their past, deserved to embrace. The convoy rolled to a stop in front of the towering iron gates of the correctional facility, a place where hope often felt as cold and distant as the steel bars that held the prisoners inside. The gates loomed tall, their unyielding presence a stark reminder of lives halted and paths derailed. The metal seemed to echo countless untold stories of despair, redemption, and longing. From the lead SUV, Donald Trump stepped out. He wasn't wearing his trademark suit or tie. Instead, he was dressed in a simple, dark coat that seemed almost unassuming, yet it carried an air of quiet resolve. As he stood there, framed by the somber backdrop of the facility, it was clear he wasn't there as a politician seeking applause or accolades. He was there as a man willing to confront the margins of society, where voices often go unheard and humanity is too easily overlooked. The iron gates creaked open, the sound heavy and deliberate, reverberating through the empty corridors of the facility like a somber overture. The faint shuffle of guards and officials broke the silence, their voices hushed, almost reverent. As they greeted the president, Trump shook their hands firmly, his demeanor stripped of any grandeur or pretense. His gaze carried no air of superiority, no veil of authority, only determination and something much rarer, genuine compassion. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was thick with tension and curiosity. Trump was led into a small, dimly lit room. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting uneven glows over worn tables and chairs that had clearly seen better days. Around those tables sat about 20 inmates, men who had distinguished themselves through their efforts to reform. These weren't hardened criminals beyond redemption. They were people who had made mistakes but were trying, in their own ways, to find their way back. The inmates sat in silence, their postures stiff, their expressions a mix of confusion and guarded skepticism. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others kept their gazes fixed on the floor, unwilling or unable to meet the president's eyes. There was no press, no cameras, no booming voice announcing the president's presence. Just the quiet realization that one of the most powerful men in the world was standing before them. Trump entered the room with slow, deliberate steps. The sound of his shoes against the floor was the only noise cutting through the heavy stillness. His presence seemed to shrink the space, making the room feel both smaller and warmer at the same time. He stopped near the center, his gaze sweeping across the faces in front of him. Some inmates dared a quick glance at him, their expressions flickering with surprise. Others avoided his eyes entirely, retreating behind walls of uncertainty and self-doubt. Standing tall, Trump rested his hand lightly on the back of a chair in front of him, pausing for a moment before he began to speak. His voice, deep and steady, carried through the room with a mix of authority and unexpected warmth. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his tone neither condescending nor rehearsed, but genuine. "I didn't come here today to judge you. I'm not here to talk about the mistakes you've made or the past decisions that brought you to this place." He paused, his words hanging in the air like a lifeline being cast into turbulent waters. "I'm here for one simple reason," he continued, his voice softening but still carrying the weight of conviction. "I'm here to listen. I'm here to understand." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. A few inmates lifted their heads, their eyes betraying curiosity. Others remained still, their guarded expressions unchanged, their skepticism palpable. Trump didn't flinch under the silence. Instead, he stepped closer to the group, his gaze searching, not for answers, but for connection. "I know," he said, his voice steady, "that when you walked through those gates, society closed its doors to you. I know that many of you feel forgotten, dismissed, or even condemned by the world outside these walls. But let me tell you something, it doesn't have to be that way." He took a step forward, his words growing more deliberate, more personal. "Today, I'm not here to speak for the government or the system. I'm here to hear your stories, not because I need them, but because you deserve to tell them. Because in this country, we believe in second chances. And I want to see the people who can take those second chances and turn them into something extraordinary." The room began to shift, almost imperceptibly. The air grew lighter, the weight of silence thinning. A few inmates lifted their eyes, and for the first time, a faint glimmer of something new, something fragile but real, began to appear in their expressions. Hope. It was tentative, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it was there. Trump's words seemed to chip away at the invisible walls surrounding the room. His presence was no longer just that of a leader or a president. It was that of someone who, perhaps for the first time in a long time, was offering these men what they thought they had lost forever: a chance to be seen, to be heard, to be believed in. The silence gave way to something else, an energy that felt almost alive. It wasn't just the presence of the president that filled the room. It was the promise of something deeper, something transformative. For Trump, this wasn't just another engagement on his calendar or a photo opportunity. This was a moment to plant seeds of hope, even in the most barren of soils. And for the men in that room, it was the first glimpse of light breaking through the darkness. The room was heavy with silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind charged with emotion, where every feeling, hesitation, anxiety, hope, and a longing to be understood, seemed to hang in the air. Eyes, some wary and some searching, fixed on the man standing before them. Respect was evident, but there was something deeper, unspoken, a yearning for answers, for something to hold on to in the middle of their turmoil. For a moment, nobody moved, as if frozen by the weight of their own thoughts. Then, slowly, a man raised his hand. His movements were hesitant, almost reluctant, as though afraid to break the fragile silence. The man was Marcus, his broad shoulders and sturdy build hinting at the life of strength he had once known. His face, lined and weathered, bore the unmistakable marks of years filled with struggle and regret. Once, he had been a successful businessman, a pillar in his community, but a series of poor decisions had brought his life crashing down, leaving him with nothing. Clearing his throat, Marcus spoke, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and sincerity. "Mr. President," he began, pausing as though searching for the right words. "I've lost everything: my family, my career, my self-respect, all because of the poor choices I made. I don't know if I still have a chance, or if it's already too late." As the final word left his lips, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye turned to Marcus, the weight of his confession settling over the space like a heavy blanket. Trump, standing near the front of the room, didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to Marcus, his gaze locking onto the man's eyes, which were filled with pain and desperation. There was no rush in Trump's movements, no haste in his demeanor. He seemed to want Marcus to feel that his words were not just heard but truly understood. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Trump spoke. His voice was steady and strong, each word deliberate. "Marcus," he said, his tone carrying a mix of firmness and compassion, "your mistakes do not define you. Mistakes are part of the journey. They're lessons, not destinations. What truly matters is what you do right now, in this moment, to make things right." Trump paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "This country, Marcus, this system we're working to change, exists to provide opportunities for people who are willing to rise from the ashes and start anew. And I believe you can do that. I believe you still have the strength to rebuild." The words seemed to cut through the dense fog of despair that had clouded Marcus's heart. His eyes glistened as tears began to form, but alongside the tears was something new, a flicker of hope, faint but undeniable. Trump's belief in him felt real, tangible, and for the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by his failures. Before the silence could stretch too long, another figure stirred. This time, it was John, a thin, frail man who seemed to shrink under the weight of his own presence. His shoulders were hunched, as if they carried the burdens of a lifetime of regret. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements hesitant and cautious. Every eye in the room shifted to him as he cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper when he began to speak. "Mr. President," John said, his voice wavering like a fragile thread, "I've done things that even I can't forgive myself for. I can't expect society to accept me. But," he paused, his voice cracking with emotion, "could God ever forgive someone like me?" The room was once again consumed by silence, but this time, it was heavier, more profound. The weight of John's question seemed to press down on everyone, even the toughest among them. Trump, standing still at the front of the room, took a deep breath before walking slowly toward John. When he reached him, he placed a firm yet gentle hand on John's shoulder. His gaze was steady, his eyes filled with understanding and an almost fatherly warmth. "John," Trump began, his voice lowering as though speaking to an old friend, "the most beautiful thing about faith is forgiveness. God doesn't dwell on the mistakes of your past. He sees your heart and what you choose to do today. The Bible tells us, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. The new has come." Trump paused, his words sinking into the quiet room. God hasn't abandoned you, John. He believes in second chances. And so do I." Trump's words seemed to linger in the air, filling the room with something that felt almost sacred. He looked deeply into John's eyes, his voice soft but resolute as he continued. "The past, John, is a door that's already closed, but you hold the power to open a new one, a door to hope, redemption, and opportunity, and I believe you have the strength to walk through it." The room remained silent, but the energy had shifted. John's shoulders, once hunched under the weight of his past, seemed to relax just slightly. Tears welled in his eyes, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming release of hearing words he had longed to believe. Around the room, the other inmates watched, many of them wiping their own eyes or bowing their heads in quiet reflection. Trump's words didn't just resonate with John. They rippled through the entire room, touching hearts that had long been closed off. Though the silence lingered, it was no longer heavy. It was filled with empathy, introspection, and a new sense of possibility. Each man seemed to sit a little straighter, their eyes holding a flicker of belief that perhaps their stories weren't finished, that perhaps their futures weren't lost. These weren't just words of comfort. They were seeds of hope, planted in a room that had seen too much despair. And as the atmosphere softened, it became clear, no matter how dark the past may seem, the future remains open to anyone brave enough to rise and rebuild. The conversation in the small, dimly lit room unfolded like a slow, deliberate symphony. Each word spoken seemed to reach into the hidden corners of the inmates' hearts, places they themselves had perhaps long forgotten. Their tough exteriors, built from years of guarding against disappointment and judgment, began to crack. Through the cracks emerged raw pain, regret, and an unspoken but unmistakable longing for a chance to start over. Trump stood near the front of the room, his posture steady, his attention unwavering. He listened to every word, every story shared, without interrupting, without rushing anyone. His demeanor made it clear. In that moment, nothing was more important to him than the men and women standing before him. Suddenly, there was a shift in the room. Slowly, a woman stood up. She moved deliberately, as if the act of standing itself required courage. She was wearing the standard, plain uniform of an inmate. Her graying hair was neatly tied back, a sign of someone who still held onto a sense of dignity even in difficult circumstances. Her hands trembled slightly as they hung by her sides, but her eyes held something different, a quiet but determined resolve. This was Mary, once a beloved teacher who had guided countless students through their formative years. But her life had taken a turn, and mistakes she could not undo had led her to this place. Now, she found herself grappling with the heavy weight of regret and an inner battle that seemed endless. She took a deep breath, her voice quivering as she began to speak. "Mr. President," she said, pausing as if searching for the strength to continue. "I used to stand in front of classrooms, telling children they could accomplish anything if they were patient and did the right thing. I spent years teaching them to work hard, to believe in themselves." Her voice caught, and she hesitated for a moment before pressing on. "But then I destroyed myself. I lost everything. I lost the values I spent my life trying to instill in others." The room fell completely silent, every person present holding their breath as they listened. Mary's voice grew softer, almost a whisper, but the weight of her words carried across the room. "How can I ever regain the trust of others? And how can I forgive myself for what I've done?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was a silence of shared understanding, of people who carried their own burdens of guilt and loss. For a moment, the air felt heavy, almost tangible. With the collective emotions in the room, Trump broke the silence, walking slowly toward Mary. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he knew that his approach was as much a part of his answer as the words he was about to speak. When he reached her, he stopped just a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back like a teacher preparing to deliver a profound lesson. "Mary," he began, his voice firm and resonant, each word deliberate and carrying a sense of undeniable truth. "Trust isn't something handed out easily. It's not a gift. It's something you have to rebuild, day by day, action by action." He paused, letting the words settle. Then, with a softer tone, he continued, "But do you know what makes me believe in you? It's your story, Mary." Mary lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, it was as though time had stopped, the room falling away, leaving only her and Trump. "You were a teacher," Trump said, his voice steady, "someone who inspired and guided others. Your mistakes caused you to fall. Yes, but those same mistakes can now become the most powerful lesson you've ever taught. Think about this. The children you once taught, the ones who look to you for guidance, need to know that life isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you fall. They need to see that even when life knocks you down, you can rise again stronger, wiser, better." His words hung in the air like a lifeline, offered not just to Mary but to everyone in the room. Trump turned slightly, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him, his voice growing more deliberate. "We don't regain trust by talking about the past. We regain it through what we do in the present. If you show the world that you're changing, that you're turning regret into action, then the trust of others will follow. And just as importantly, you'll learn to trust yourself again." Mary's head bowed slightly, her shoulders trembling, but not from sorrow. Her reaction was a release, a letting go of the weight she had carried alone for so long. Trump's words weren't just an answer to her question. They were a beacon, a guiding light for everyone in that room who had once thought their path was irreversibly dark. Around the room, others watched, some wiping their eyes, others sitting still but visibly moved. People who had long believed that every door had been closed to them were now seeing, perhaps for the first time, that there might still be a way forward. It wasn't an easy path. It was narrow and steep, but it was illuminated by hope. Trump turned back to face the group, his expression softening into a small but determined smile. "Remember," he said, his voice clear and resolute, "trust isn't lost forever. It can always be rebuilt, with sincerity, with action, and with the belief that the future is still wide open for those willing to truly try." As the meeting neared its conclusion, Donald Trump stepped forward, stopping at the center of the room. He stood tall, his hands loosely clasped, his gaze sweeping over each face with a commanding focus, tempered by a profound compassion. In the stillness of the small room, his voice rang out strong, deliberate, and deeply meaningful. "Looking around this room, I don't see prisoners. I don't see mistakes or failures. What I see are people with potential, people standing at one of the most important crossroads of their lives." His words caused the room to pause, as though the air itself had grown heavier with the weight of their meaning. Each inmate, each member of the prison staff, quietly fixed their attention on him. Some eyes still carried traces of doubt, but most began to glimmer with a spark of hope, a spark they thought had long been extinguished. Trump continued, his voice lowering, each word carving itself into the quiet atmosphere. "This new system of justice we've created isn't just something written on paper. It is a promise from an entire nation that everyone deserves a second chance. Not because we deny the mistakes of the past, but because we believe that from those mistakes, people can rise stronger than ever." He walked slowly, his eyes meeting those of the individuals seated before him, as if to deliver a personal message to each one. A few inmates bowed their heads, unable to hold back their emotions, yet none looked away from him entirely. Don't think I'm here to lecture you or pass judgment. I'm here to tell you that your future doesn't end within these walls. I want you to remember this. No one in this room is worthless. You are not just numbers. You are not just mistakes. You are people, and you have the right to start over. He paused briefly, raising his hands slightly, as if to emphasize the weight of his next words. Take this opportunity. Show the world, but more importantly, show yourselves that you can change, that you can do better, that you can become stories of inspiration. I hope to see the day when I meet you outside these gates, not as people who were once imprisoned, but as people who have triumphed over themselves. The room seemed frozen in time. Then, one person began to clap. The slow but resolute applause quickly spread, merging into a heartfelt ovation. It was not for the fame of a politician, but for a message that had struck a chord deep within, a promise of hope and forgiveness that resonated with every soul in the room. As Trump walked out of the room, he didn't look back, but behind him, the eyes of those who had once carried the weight of despair now shone with a new belief. It was the belief that no matter who they had been, the future could still be rewritten by their own hands. Donald Trump's visit to the correctional facility did not end when he walked out through the heavy iron gates. On the contrary, it was only the beginning. The story of his heartfelt words, of teary eyes and firm handshakes, quickly spread throughout the prison, and then beyond the barbed wire fences to reach the community outside. Within the prison, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Inmates who had once lived in a state of despair began to approach rehabilitation programs with a renewed sense of determination. For them, the visit wasn't a display of power, but a reaffirmation that they still had value, that the world outside was ready to welcome them if they were willing to change. John, the man who had asked about God's forgiveness, became a shining example. After serving his time, he not only rebuilt his life, but also devoted himself to helping former inmates like him. He founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing jobs and social reintegration, calling it Second Chance Hope. I used to think the door to my life had closed, John shared during a seminar, but now I realize that I've always held the key to open it again. Marcus, who once believed he had no chances left, opened a small bakery in his hometown. But this was no ordinary bakery. Marcus trained and hired people with pasts like his, individuals who needed a helping hand to rebuild their lives. On the bakery's sign were the words, "Sweet beginnings from second chances." Mary, the fallen teacher, returned to her mission. With the support of an educational organization, she began teaching children from underprivileged backgrounds, children who had been overlooked by the same system she had once stumbled within. "I'm not just teaching them knowledge," Mary said. "I'm teaching them resilience, showing them that mistakes aren't the end, but a chapter in a story waiting to be rewritten." The impact of Trump's visit didn't stop with these individuals. It rippled through the broader community. Social organizations, businesses, and even the legal system began paying greater attention to creating real opportunities for former inmates. Seminars on second chances were held, reintegration programs were established, and, most importantly, hearts that had once been closed began to open. Trump's story was not just about a visit, not just about a conversation. It became a symbol of forgiveness and a belief that every person, no matter how far they may have strayed from the right path, could find their way back and build a better future. For those who heard this story, it served as a reminder that society doesn't just need laws to maintain order, it also needs compassion to foster rebirth. And sometimes, a single word, a glance, or a presence at the right moment can change an entire life, or even an entire community. This story is not merely about a president's visit, nor is it simply an event in history. It is a vivid testament to the power of hope, redemption, and the capacity for renewal that every individual possesses. It speaks of moments where hearts that seemed closed forever were awakened by a newfound belief. It brings to life a profound truth: no one is worthless, and every mistake, no matter how grave, can become the foundation for a new beginning. Donald Trump did not just deliver a message. He planted seeds of hope in what appeared to be the most barren of soils. Those seeds took root in the hearts of inmates who rediscovered their self-worth, in the eyes of those who once thought opportunity had permanently passed them by, and in a society learning to embrace the concept of second chances. That visit didn't just transform the lives of those prisoners. It etched a critical lesson for all of us. Forgiveness is not weakness, but the strength to rebuild. Second chances are not about leniency, but about faith in the potential for change. And hope doesn't only save the lost, it enriches the soul of humanity as a whole, no matter the circumstances. This story reminds us that every person has the ability to overcome darkness, as long as they have the courage to believe and the determination to change. And sometimes, all they need is a hand extended at just the right moment.